sail and going to Southeast Asia, or going to Yemen and so on, and trading backed by money lenders or small-scale financiers. This is indeed totally not the case. It was a really mass-scale operation that you have to remember. It is basically, you have these merchant guilds, and there are a bunch of them mentioned in temple inscriptions and so on. And these are big operations which survive over centuries. They're almost like modern companies with shareholders and so on. And these merchant guilds are the ones that carry out the bulk of the trade. And they have contracts with artisan guilds who provide them the stuff. But interestingly, the financing comes from large temples. This is very, very important to understand. The reason the temples were so rich is not the impression we have as royal grants being given to them all the time. The real reason these temples were important and rich was that they functioned as banks. And we have plenty of evidence, which I've mentioned, and there are new books also written about this, about how the temples had these contracts for funding infrastructure. They had contracts for funding these great voyages, funding working capital for the weavers and so on. And basically, this was the ecosystem. It was basically a structured multinational operation funded by large banks. Now what happens is that suddenly all of this falls apart. Now, there is a lot of debate about why it does, but one event does happen during that period which must surely be a part of the story, which is, of course, with the Turkic invasions, the temples get sacked. And quite apart from the death and destruction it may have caused, one thing that it does cause is that suddenly the Indians in the Indian Ocean lose their financial muscle, because these temples can no longer function as basically backers of this trade. So I think this is an important thing that you were referring to. There's a lot more about this in the book. Hopefully we'll read about it. The other that you mentioned is about, of course, the genetics. There's a lot of interesting genetics that's coming out and will continue to come out. It's not a fixed piece of evidence right now, so be aware that whatever I'm saying is as of this date. It can change. The evidence that we basically have right now is that human beings came out of Africa, and the landscape they came out on is quite different from the landscape we have right now, because the sea levels were a lot lower than they are now. So the Persian Gulf, for instance, was above water. And then in and around what is now, I would call it the Indo-Iranian continuum, this idea that Iran and northern India were sort of separate entities is wrong, because you see the Balochistan, which is now an impassable desert, was actually grassland, scrubland, and people were going back and forth. So it was a continuum. And basically, there's a massive expansion in population with people living in there. Incidentally, at that point in time, they also interbreed with Neanderthals, which is why all of us in this room will have 2 to 4% of our genes from Neanderthal sources. Then what happens is that from this zone, there are huge groups of people who move out. So there's one group who goes off to Australia, another group at some point in time goes off and colonizes East Asia and so on. And then there is another group, maybe something in the range of 30,000 years ago, who moved down to southern India, who are called ancestral South Indians. But there is a bunch of people who continue to hang around in this Indo-Iranian continuum. And they, during the last ice age, basically what happens is that most of the world becomes really, really cold. And so, except for a few small isolated groups in Siberia who somehow survive by hunting the mammoths, most human beings basically are pushed down southwards. So most of Europe gets abandoned, people move down southwards. In Asia, basically, they get pushed down again much southwards. So Central Asia, for example, gets completely emptied out because it's a really cold, empty desert. And some populations are still hanging around in what is relatively warmer, which is the Indo-Iranian continuum. And one branch of that becomes the ancestral North Indians, the fellows who are living on this part of, who are living in northwestern India. Now what happens is the things begin to warm up. And as they warm up, the coastlines all get flooded, and this begins to spread around about 10,000, between 10 to 8,000 years ago. New waves of people begin moving out. And among the various people who move out, are people from this Indo-Iranian continuum who push out northwards into Central Asia, which becomes habitable, and then further out and west into Europe, which is incidentally the most likely reason why we have genetic affinities to the Eastern Europeans. Not so closely with Western Europeans, incidentally, but with Eastern Europeans. And this is the link, the linguistic, genetic link that people talk about. Oddly enough, as I pointed out to you, the direction of movement of population is from south to north. More importantly, these are not Aryans on horses and chariots. These are small Neolithic groups. So I'm sorry to disappoint anybody who has these grand visions of conquering Aryans going in either direction. These are small Neolithic groups. And then, with all this flooding going on and climate changing, groups of people along the Euphrates, along the Saraswati Indus valleys, begin to settle and begin to create civilization. This is the origin of who we are. And incidentally, in all of this, lots of migration happen, lots of people intermarry, breed with each other, lots of people move around by the sea, by land routes. There are incidentally people coming in from the eastern side as well, from what is now Cambodia, the Austrasian peoples. So people don't realize this, but for example, the people of the Khasis of Meghalaya are actually genetically linked to the Khmers, and so on. And there's a lot of merging and mixing going on. And this is who we are. We are in the end the result of all this churning, hence the name of the book, The Ocean of Churn. This is churning of genes, ideas, influences.
I wanted to ask a question. You have mentioned, that the Rig Veda, for example, would perhaps be a legacy of the Harappan culture. But from my understanding is that the Harappan culture was in fact settled cities. These were basically urban concentrations. While the Rig Veda seems to be composed by people who were essentially pastoralists. These were people who were not really at that time engaged in settled agriculture. So it would seem a little incongruous that Rig Veda should actually be something which comes from a culture which was very different kind of culture.
So first of all, it's very important to realize that the Rig Vedic culture is settled, but it is not urban. There's a difference. There's a difference between being pastoral and being not settled. So point I'm making is, the Rig Veda, if you read it yourself, you will see these are settled people. They're agriculturists, but yes, you're right that there are no large cities mentioned in it. They do mention, however, towns and settlements and fortifications in them very, very clearly. There are lots of settled. But you're absolutely right, it doesn't mention anything that would relate to the great cities of Harappa or Mohenjo-daro and so on. And there's a very good reason for this, because as I mentioned even in the book, the Rig Vedic society is really early Harappan. It is not late Harappan or mature Harappan, which had these great cities. This predates that period, and there are several reasons which I mentioned, not just in this book, but in my previous book as well, that this is a society that is basically settled, but hasn't built these cities. Why? I'll just give you one example why this would be the case. We know for a fact that there was this massive river that is the center point of the Rig Vedic life. This is a river that they repeatedly call the Saraswati. They clearly mention in the text that this river flows between the Sutlej and the Yamuna. Later texts tell us that that river dried up, and we happen to have this empty river channel, the Khaggar, which is basically flows along this channel. We also have lots of settlements on either side of it, incidentally, suggesting that it must have been very important. And these settlements, the dating of these settlements is now really for example, Birhana in Haryana is now being found to be at 7,000 BC. So it's actually probably the oldest continuously settled place in this part of the world. So these are really old settlements going back to late Neolithic, early Bronze Age. And this is the late Neolithic, early Bronze Age society living along the Saraswati River that we are describing. So this predates the great Mohenjo-daro period that we think was what we. Secondly,